My name is Sarah, I'm 32 years old. And I'm finally going to tell this story. I've written it out in my head 1,000 times, in the shower, in the car, on the drive to work at 3 a.m. when sleep won't come. I've practiced the words, rehearsed the anger, shaped the narrative into something that makes sense. But every time I've tried to actually speak it out loud, something stops me. Maybe it's shame. Maybe it's the fact that if I say it, I have to accept it's real. Maybe it's because there are people I still love in this story, and the truth about them hurts too much. But I'm tired of carrying it alone. I don't know where to start exactly. Most people probably start with the tragedy, right? The inciting incident, the moment everything changed. But that's not how real life works. Real life doesn't have a clear beginning. It's always tangled, always messy, always rooted in things that happened long before you were born. So maybe I'll start here, with the image of my mother's face when my college acceptance letter came. It was March, and I remember standing in the kitchen of our house in suburban New Jersey, a split level we'd lived in since I was 8. The afternoon light was doing that thing it does in spring, where everything looks slightly surreal and golden. My mom was making dinner. She made dinner at the same time every night like clockwork, 5:30 p.m. That was the unspoken rule of our house. Dinner at 5:30, everyone at the table, no distractions. The envelope was fat and cream-colored, and my hands were shaking as I opened it. I was 17. I'd been checking the mailbox obsessively for weeks, driving my parents crazy with my anxiety about the whole process. I'd applied early decision to Princeton because I'd been told since birth that was the goal, not an option, the goal. When I pulled out the letter and saw the words "Congratulations," something in me broke open, not dramatically. I didn't scream or cry. I just stood there in my school uniform. I went to a Catholic prep school that wore uniforms, feeling like my whole body had suddenly become real. Like before that moment I'd been a sketch, and now I was being filled in with color. My mom looked up from the stove. She was making her famous marinara sauce, the one she'd perfected over 30 years of marriage, 32 years of motherhood, infinite years of being the person who made things right. She had flour on her face. Her hair was grey in places, more grey than I'd noticed before, and she was wearing her reading glasses on a chain around her neck. When she saw my face, she crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and took the letter from my hands. She read the first line, and then something happened to her face. It was like a door had opened inside her, and all this light poured out. She didn't hug me. She wasn't a hugger, my mother. She was a practical woman, a quiet woman, but she touched my cheek with one flour-dusted hand and said, "I knew you would." Not "I'm proud of you." Not "I'm so happy." "I knew you would." As if everything that had happened up to that point, all the sacrifices, all the things I'd done without fully understanding why, had been building to this one moment. As if my whole life had been an equation, and now we'd finally solved it. My father came home from work about an hour later. He worked in finance, something in the city that took up most of his time and energy. He was the kind of father who showed his love through provision. He made sure the house was paid for, the fridge was full, we had nice things. But he wasn't warm. He was efficient. He entered the kitchen already loosening his tie, already mentally checking off the list of things that needed to be done that evening. My mom handed him the letter without saying anything. I watched him read it, watched his face go still for a moment, and then he nodded. He folded the letter back into the envelope with precise movements and handed it back to me. "That's good, Sarah," he said. "That's what we're working toward." What we're working toward. That phrase settled into my bones in a way I didn't understand at the time. It implied there was a we in my achievements, that my success wasn't just mine, that it belonged to them too. I didn't know then how much that would cost me. I need to go back further to make you understand how we got here, because the truth is, the sacrifice didn't start with my Princeton acceptance. It started much earlier. It started before I was even aware there was a sacrifice happening. I'm the oldest, that's the first fact that matters. My brother Michael came 2 years after me. He was born on a snowy day in January, and I remember my father bringing me to the hospital to meet him. I was 3 years old, which meant I have this vague, dreamlike memory of the whole thing, my mother in a hospital bed looking tired and beautiful, my father holding this tiny red creature that was apparently mine now in some ineffable way. A present, a responsibility, a version of myself that was separate. Michael was beautiful, objectively, factually beautiful. He had these enormous dark eyes and perfect skin, and even as a baby, he had this serious expression that made people stop and stare. Relatives would come over and coo over him, and I would sit nearby in my little girl clothes, feeling somehow like I was watching my own displacement happen in slow motion. But here's the thing about being the oldest daughter in a first-generation Italian-American family with traditional values and immigrant-era anxieties. You're not just a child, you're a statement. You're the proof that your parents can do this, that they can raise a successful, accomplished person in America. You're the living answer to all the doubts, all the whispers in the old language from relatives, all the internal fears about whether they made the right choice coming here, building this life. For my parents, I think I was always an audition. They were immigrants, or more accurately, my mother was a first-generation American whose parents had come from Naples, and my father was the son of a Sicilian man who'd worked in construction and a German woman who converted to Catholicism. They were middle class in the way that means you're always slightly terrified of falling out of it. You work constantly. You invest everything in your children's futures. You believe with a religious fervor that education is the only thing that matters, the only thing that guarantees survival. My mother had gone to college, a small Catholic women's college in Massachusetts, and she'd been the first in her family to do it. She'd felt the weight of that accomplishment her whole life. She'd chosen practical things, nursing school at first, then business administration because nursing was too difficult. She'd never worked after she had me, which she never quite said she resented, but which hung in the air sometimes, particularly on days when she seemed particularly small in the house, when her accomplished hands had nothing accomplished to do. My father had gone to a public university and then to business school at a school nobody had heard of. He'd worked his way up from entry-level positions to something respectable in finance, but he carried with him this sense that he'd never quite made it to the top, that some invisible ceiling had stopped him, and he'd decided that wasn't going to happen to his children. Especially not to the girl. Girls had it harder, he believed. Girls had to be twice as good to get half as far, so if he was going to have a daughter, that daughter was going to be exceptional. I was 7 years old when I first realized this. It was in 2nd grade, and I brought home a report card with all A's except 1 B+ in handwriting. My mother had said nothing when she signed it, which meant she was disappointed. My father had made a small, disappointed sound in his throat when he looked at it, as if he'd tasted something he didn't expect to taste. Handwriting matters, my mother said that night, not in an angry way, in a matter-of-fact way like she was stating a fact of physics. People judge you by your handwriting, teachers especially. So I spent the next 3 months doing handwriting drills every single day. My mother would sit with me at the kitchen table, and we'd practice letters over and over. It was meditative, almost peaceful, but it also made me understand that there were standards in our house that weren't negotiable, that a B+ in handwriting was a failure, that even the way your letters looked mattered to the collective effort. Michael, meanwhile, brought home a report card around the same time with a B in math and didn't practice anything. My parents sat with him for a few minutes, asked about what he didn't understand, and then let it go. "He's a boy," my mother said to her sister once on the phone. "Boys are naturally less organized. That's fine. He'll grow out of it." I heard her say that, and something very small and crucial broke inside me. I was the one who had to be exceptional. Michael just had to exist. By the time I was 10, I had a system down. I woke up early and did my homework before school. I took detailed notes in class. I reread chapters the night before a test. I could barely articulate why I did all this. It was just the water I swam in, the air I breathed. But I understood at some fundamental level that my worth was connected to my grades, that my parents' pride in me was proportional to my achievements, and that letting my standards slip was the same as letting my family down. Michael, by contrast, struggled, not dramatically, not enough that anyone would call it learning disabilities or anything clinical. He was just fine. He was a C and B student. He got in trouble sometimes, not seriously, just the normal stuff. He forgot his homework. He made jokes in class and got detention. He was likable and easygoing and deeply, fundamentally unambitious. And my parents watched him with this expression I couldn't quite name. Concern, frustration, maybe love but a different kind, a desperate kind, the kind that implied they were trying to save him from something. When I was 12 and Michael was 10, my mother sat me down in my room after I'd gotten a 98 on a science test instead of 100. "Do you know what your job is?" she asked me. I remember thinking it was an odd question. I was 12. My job was to be a child, to go to school, listen to my teachers, be respectful and do well. Your job, my mother continued, is to be the one we don't have to worry about. That way Dad and I can focus on helping Michael. He needs more from us. You're strong, you're capable, we need you to be the one who does it on her own. I didn't cry when she said that. I didn't feel sad exactly, but I felt a door close inside me. A realization that love in our family had a shape, and that shape was achievement. If I achieved, I was worthy of a certain kind of love, the proud, proud love. But the other kind of love, the kind that needs and demands and requires care, that was reserved for Michael. That was the love that meant someone fought for you, guided you, believed in you even when you didn't believe in yourself. I could have one or the other, not both. So I chose the one that made my mother smile that specific way, with her whole face open and light. I chose to be the strong one, the capable one, the one who did it on her own. And I became very, very good at it. High school was when everything accelerated. I went to Blessed Sacrament Prep, a Catholic school that was known for being rigorous. It was a 40-minute drive from our house, which meant I left at 7 a.m. and didn't get home until 3:30 p.m. most days, later if I stayed for student government or volunteer work or debate club. By then, Michael was in middle school at the public school 10 minutes away, coming home at 3:00 p.m. and usually immediately retreating to his room or going to a friend's house. Our family dinner time, that sacred 5:30 p.m. rule, was becoming increasingly strained. My father would come home from work angry or tired or both. My mother would be in the kitchen, stressed about dinner, increasingly stressed about Michael's grades and Michael's attitude and Michael's future. Michael would be sullen, resentful of the interrogation that always came during dinner. How were your grades? Did you turn in that project? Have you thought about what you want to do for high school? And I would be quiet. I would eat my mother's food, which was always excellent, and I would offer updates about school in a measured way designed not to attract too much attention. I'd learned early that there was a performance I was supposed to give, successful but not arrogant, independent but not distant, accomplished but not so accomplished that it highlighted Michael's failures. It was exhausting, but I was 16 and driven by the kind of all-consuming ambition that made sense in our house. I wanted to go to Princeton. My father had mentioned it so many times it had become like a family religion. Princeton was where smart girls went, smart girls from good families who would make good marriages and raise good children and secure the family's status for another generation. So I did everything right. I took AP classes and got A's. I was on the debate team and we went to regionals. I volunteered at a homeless shelter on weekends. I worked part-time at a tutoring center to save money for college. I wrote a college essay so introspective and moving that my English teacher cried when she read it. I got a 2210 on the SATs, which was excellent but not perfect, which was somehow even more shameful because it meant I'd made mistakes. I'd been careless somewhere. My father's reaction to my 2210 was to suggest I take the test again. My mother said, "That's very good, honey," in a way that meant it wasn't quite good enough, but we wouldn't discuss it further. I took the test again. I got a 2240, better but still not perfect, still not the kind of score that felt like a full victory. My father bought a book to help me prepare for the third time. My mother started packing my lunch every single day with specific proteins and vegetables that were supposedly good for brain function. They were optimizing me, the way you might optimize a sports car you were about to race. Everything was calibrated toward the finish line of my college acceptance. Michael, meanwhile, was falling apart. He'd switched high schools twice. First he went to a private prep school like mine, but he hated it, said it was pretentious and that he didn't fit in. My parents argued about whether to let him switch. My father wanted him to tough it out. My mother was sympathetic but ultimately backed my father. But after 1 year, Michael's grades were so bad and his attendance so poor that they had to let him switch to the public school. He seemed relieved, but the relief didn't translate to improvement. He was doing fine in public school, but fine in our family was equivalent to failing. My father would drink more wine at dinner on nights when Michael's report card came home. My mother would take longer baths, and I would sit there, perfectly groomed and accomplished, feeling a strange mixture of guilt and resentment. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about being the successful sibling: you don't feel good about it. You feel complicit. You feel like you're benefiting from the comparison, like every time your parents expressed disappointment in Michael, they were offering you a gift wrapped up in his failure. And I hated that feeling. But I also couldn't stop engineering situations that would highlight the distance between us. Like I didn't mean to do it exactly. But I'd mentioned my debate team's success at dinner, and I could see my father's jaw clench, could see him thinking about Michael, about how Michael had quit the debate team after one meeting because he said it was boring. Or I'd get home after volunteering at the shelter, and my mother would ask me detailed questions about my experience, which were often fascinating because I was the kind of person who made experiences fascinating, who extracted meaning from everything. And Michael would be sitting right there, and I could see him computing the difference, comparing his basic daily existence to my richly textured, purposeful life. I didn't mean to make him look bad, but I was succeeding so spectacularly that it was impossible not to. When I was 17 and Michael was 15, something shifted. He came home one day looking different. Not physically different, though there was that too. He'd gotten taller, his face had changed in the way teenage faces do. But there was something in his energy that was different. He seemed lighter. He seemed happy. My mother noticed it before I did. She cornered me in the kitchen one afternoon and asked if I knew what was going on with him. He'd been happier the past few weeks, she said, more positive, actually talking about the future. Maybe he's just growing up, I offered. No, my mother said, in a way that suggested she'd already rejected that possibility. Something's different. He hasn't even fought with your father in almost a month. It turned out that Michael had found a girl. Her name was Emma, and she was a junior at his high school. She was, by Michael's description, really cool and different from the girls I usually see, which meant she was artsy and read books and played guitar, and didn't seem to care much about the conventional markers of high school success that Michael had never been able to achieve anyway. My parents' reaction was complicated. On the one hand, they were thrilled that Michael seemed happy. Happiness in my brother was a rare commodity, and my parents would take any evidence that he was developing normally, that he might grow into a functional adult, that their fears about his future might be unfounded. On the other hand, I think they were terrified of distraction. College was coming. Michael needed to focus on his grades, on his future, not on some girl. My father was particularly vocal about this, though he tried to be subtle. He'd ask questions about Emma's family, her background, her academic standing. He'd make comments about how important it was for Michael to stay focused on his goals during these crucial years. Michael, for the first time that I could remember, stood his ground. He said he wasn't going anywhere. Emma wasn't keeping him from school, and he was happy for the first time in years, so could everyone just let him be happy? My mother took his side, quietly but firmly. She reminded my father that Michael needed support right now, not pressure. That maybe, and here her voice had a slightly accusatory tone, what Michael needed was for people to believe in him instead of constantly expressing disappointment about what he wasn't achieving. There was a silence after that. My father didn't say anything, but we all felt the weight of the implication. My mother was suggesting that my parents had failed Michael, that their approach, focus, pressure, high expectations, had backfired in his case, that maybe, just maybe, their way of loving him had actually been hurting him. I watched my father's face go tight. He's going to end up nowhere because no one's pushing him to be somewhere, he said finally. That's what happens when you let kids coast. He's not coasting, my mother said. He's finding things that matter to him. That's not coasting, that's living. It was the most direct argument I'd seen them have in years. And as it was happening, I felt something cold settle in my stomach, because I realized with a clarity that was almost nauseating that my mother's defense of Michael's right to be happy, to be himself, to not be optimized to death, that defense was happening in contrast to me. To a daughter who had accepted the optimization, who had internalized the pressure, who had made the sacrifice without question. My mother was saying Michael deserved to be happy, and implied in that statement was the understanding that I had never fought for happiness the way Michael was fighting for it, that I had accepted the bargain without the negotiation. Implication, I was a fool. The year I was applying to college was the year everything fractured. Michael was doing better in school. I don't know if it was Emma's influence or his own growth or simply the relief of being allowed to exist on his own terms, but his grades improved. Not to the level my parents wanted, but to the level that suggested he might actually graduate and go somewhere for college. Not Princeton, obviously, but somewhere. I was in application mode, which meant I was performing at an even higher level of intensity than usual. I had a strategy. I was going to apply early decision to Princeton because the early decision acceptance rate was higher and because my parents would never accept anything less. But I was also going to apply to other schools, Stanford, Harvard, Yale, Brown, as my safety schools, because my father had decided that a 2240 SAT wasn't sufficient and was making noises about me taking the test one more time. I was 17 years old, and I was approaching my own life like it was a strategic military operation. And then my mother got sick. It happened suddenly and then very slowly at the same time. In November, she went to the doctor for a routine checkup, and they found something on her mammogram. Then there were more tests, more conversations with doctors behind closed doors. By December, we knew it was cancer, breast cancer, stage 2 treatable, but still, cancer. My father became even more obsessed with my college applications. It was his way of controlling something, I think, of maintaining the sense that the world was functioning normally, that we were still progressing toward the future we'd planned. He'd sit with me at the kitchen table, and we'd go over my essay drafts, my list of schools, my timeline for applications. My mother was upstairs in the bedroom, undergoing tests and consultations and eventually starting chemotherapy, and my father and I were downstairs having coffee and discussing my future. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Michael was devastated. He was barely 17 and his mother had cancer, and everything he'd built in terms of feeling okay about himself was suddenly very fragile. But nobody really noticed how much it was affecting him, because everyone was busy noticing how well I was handling it. Because I was handling it fine. I was still going to school, still doing my volunteering, still working on my college applications. I didn't cry at dinner. I didn't break down. I held everything together with the kind of stoic professionalism that my parents had trained into me since childhood. My father was proud of how I was handling it. He said so one night. "Sarah, I'm proud of how you're managing this," he said. "You're being very strong." What he was really saying was, "You're not adding to our burden, you're not falling apart, you're not making this worse." I didn't realize at the time how much that message would cost me. My mother did 2 rounds of chemotherapy through the winter and into spring. She lost her hair, which devastated her more than the diagnosis had, I think. She sat in the shower one morning and cut off her hair because she said it was falling out anyway, and she wanted to have some control over it. I held her while she did it, and she was shaking, and I was dry-eyed and present and horrifyingly functional. By spring, her markers were improving. The cancer was responding to treatment. She'd have one more round of chemo and then surgery and then radiation, but the prognosis was good. She was going to be okay. I got my Princeton acceptance letter in March. The cancer was being beaten back, my mother was going to survive, and I'd been accepted to Princeton. Early decision. The world was correcting itself. We were going back to the plan. Everything we'd sacrificed for was paying off. But here's what I didn't understand at the time. Sacrifice is only a sacrifice if you know what you're giving up. I didn't know what I'd given up. I hadn't been old enough to know it when I was a child. And by the time I was old enough to understand what was happening, I'd been trained so thoroughly to not want the things I wasn't getting that I'd convinced myself I didn't want them. I didn't want to be a normal teenager. I wanted to be exceptional. I didn't want to be nurtured the way Michael was being nurtured. I wanted to be admired. I didn't want to be allowed to fail. I wanted to be obligated to succeed. And the thing about training someone that thoroughly in a particular way of being is that it sticks. It becomes you, not your job anymore, but your identity. So when I got to Princeton, I was ready. Princeton was perfect. I'm saying that knowing how it sounds, how privileged it sounds, how like someone bragging, but it's true. When I walked onto campus for the first time in August before freshman orientation, before I knew anyone or was part of anything, I felt like I'd come home. Not home the way your childhood house is home, but home the way your destiny feels home. Like I'd finally arrived at the place where everything I'd worked for suddenly made sense. The school itself was beautiful, Gothic architecture and manicured lawns, and the kind of intellectual intensity you can actually feel. Walking through the library for the first time, I was almost dizzy with the sense that I belonged here. That all those hours of studying, all those nights I'd sacrificed sleep for homework, all those early mornings and perfect test scores and achievements, they'd been worth it. The other students were like me, which was comforting and also slightly terrifying. They were the smartest people I'd ever met, all of them. They'd all been the best student in their schools. They'd all had similar lives to mine, though I'd learn later that some of them had had it easier, that some had arrived here through connections or legacy or money rather than pure achievement, and that was its own kind of injustice that would make me angry eventually, but not yet. I chose neurobiology as my major because it seemed serious and challenging, and the kind of thing Princeton students did. Not because I particularly loved it, but because I'd learned early not to pursue things because I loved them. I pursued things because they were difficult and impressive and would look good on a resume. I joined clubs. I volunteered. I got good grades, though there was a moment of absolute panic when I got a B+ on a chemistry exam first semester and had to sit with the feeling that maybe I wasn't actually that smart. Maybe I'd been fooling everyone the whole time. A friend said to me, "Sarah, it's just a B+. Everyone gets B+ in chemistry," and I realized that not everyone had been trained since childhood that a B+ was a failure. But I adjusted, and by sophomore year I'd found my rhythm at Princeton. I was involved in the right clubs, friends with the right people, taking the right classes, positioned to graduate with academic honors, and a resume that would get me into a good med school or grad program or whatever came next. There was a guy too. His name was David, and he was smart and handsome in a way that seemed effortless. We started dating sophomore year, and he seemed to like that I was ambitious and focused. He was pre-law from Connecticut, he'd been to private school, we spoke the same language. By senior year, we'd been together for 2 years, and there was this implicit understanding that we'd stay together, at least through the next stage, that this was building towards something. It all made sense, everything fit. And I was fine, not happy exactly, but fine. Content maybe, satisfied, the word fulfilled wasn't something I'd applied to myself because that seemed like a luxury, a thing other people could afford. I went home for Thanksgiving sophomore year and my mother was doing great. She was in remission. She'd finished all her treatment, chemo, surgery, radiation, the whole thing, and she was healthy. She had a wig she wore sometimes if she had somewhere important to go, but her hair was growing back and she seemed lighter, like she'd set down a weight. Michael was a senior in high school. He and Emma were still together, which my father still disapproved of quietly, but Michael was doing fine. He'd applied to schools that would take him without my mother having to worry about him. Nothing fancy but solid state schools, and more importantly, he seemed happy. Genuinely happy in a way I wasn't sure I'd ever been. We sat around the dinner table, my mother making her marinara, my father drinking wine, Michael talking about his plans, and something about the scene was making me ache in a way I couldn't quite articulate. My father asked about my internship plans. I said I was looking into pre-med internships, hospitals, research labs. He was satisfied. My mother asked about my classes, and I answered with the kind of detailed descriptions I'd learned to offer up. Michael mentioned that he and Emma were thinking about going to the same college, and my father made a face but didn't say anything. And I realized, sitting there, that I'd been away from this family for 4 years, and in that time, I'd become more like I was supposed to be, but not more like myself. I'd been designed to leave, raised to escape, trained to excel in order to transcend our class, our family's limited expectations, everything about our small New Jersey suburb. And I had done it. I was doing it. But there was something hollow about the doing, something that felt like I was running away from something instead of running toward it. Senior year at Princeton happened. I was applying to medical schools and MD PhD programs. I was trying to figure out what came next, but everything was exactly as it had always been, a series of steps, clearly marked, proven to lead to success. Get good grades, get good MCAT scores, apply to prestigious programs, get accepted to a prestigious program, continue being exceptional in the next arena. David and I were talking about moving in together after graduation. He was going to law school at Columbia. I hadn't decided where I was going yet, but I'd likely end up somewhere in the New York area, and then we'd build the life we were supposed to build. Good jobs, good neighborhoods, eventually a good marriage and good children, and all of it would feel like we'd finally arrived somewhere. But then something happened that I didn't expect. Michael failed to get into college. This is an important moment in the story, so I want to be very clear about what actually happened. He didn't get accepted to any of the schools he applied to. Not because he'd applied to reaches that were too high. He'd applied to state schools, to schools that took most of their applicants. He'd applied to schools that Michael, with his grades and scores, should have gotten into easily. But there was a technical issue with his applications. He'd made a mistake on his Common App. He'd checked the wrong box for something, and it was only discovered later that he'd misrepresented his GPA. Not intentionally, it was an honest mistake, a clicking the wrong button kind of thing. But rules are rules, and it turned out that he'd cheated by accident, and the schools he had gotten into a couple of schools, it turned out later, had to rescind their acceptances because of the misrepresentation. So at the end of his senior year, Michael had no college to go to. I found out about this because my mother called me crying, not hysterically. My mother doesn't do hysterics, but genuinely, quietly crying, the kind of cry that means something has broken that can't be put back together exactly the same way. Michael didn't get in anywhere, she said. I mean, he did, but there was something wrong with his application and now they're taking it back. We have to figure out what to do. I was at Princeton in my dorm, and I felt something very strange happen inside me. It was partly sympathy for Michael, partly a grim vindication of my father's fears that Michael would end up nowhere, and partly something else. Something that I can only describe as relief. Because as long as Michael was failing, I was succeeding. The comparison, the hierarchy, the proof that my parents' strategy of sacrificing for me had been the right call, all of that was secure. I didn't think about how my mother sounded on the phone, how her voice had broken, how she was clearly devastated not just by the situation, but by the implications of it. That her son, who'd finally found some happiness in high school, was now facing a future that was suddenly very uncertain. Instead, I got off the phone and I went to dinner, and I told my friends the situation and watched them react with sympathy and slightly horrified amazement that such a thing could happen, that one mistake could derail someone's entire future, and I felt important. I felt like I was connected to something dramatic, and I felt relieved that whatever they were feeling about Michael's situation, it was happening to him and not to me. He took a gap year. That's what they decided to do. Michael would work for a year, figure things out, maybe take some community college courses to show he could do college-level work, and then apply again the following year. My father handled it with quiet fury. My mother tried to be supportive. Michael was devastated, but also, I think, not entirely surprised. Like he'd always suspected something like this would happen to him, that the universe had a way of pulling the rug out from under him. By the time I graduated from Princeton, Michael was working at a car rental place and taking a psychology course at community college. I got my degree in neurobiology with honors. I got accepted to medical schools, good ones. Columbia Presbyterian, Boston University, Johns Hopkins. I chose Columbia Presbyterian because David's law school was at Columbia, because we had this vision of building a life in New York together. I moved to Manhattan the week after graduation, and I was ready. Everything I'd worked for was happening. I was going to be a doctor. I was going to marry David eventually. I was going to have the life my parents had been building for me since birth. And everyone was happy. Except the thing is, nobody actually was. Medical school was supposed to be the achievement of all achievements. But something had fundamentally changed by the time I got there. Maybe it was because I was finally separated from my parents enough to start questioning the framework I'd been operating within. Maybe it was because medical school, unlike undergrad, was full of people who were exceptional, and it was possible to not be the exceptional one for the first time in my life. Maybe it was just that I was older, and 23 is sometimes when you finally have enough perspective to question the choices someone else made for you when you were too young to consent. Whatever it was, something in my chest that had been wound very tight started to loosen, and it didn't feel good. It felt like pain. My first year of med school, I did fine. Grades were good, but they weren't the single most important thing anymore. I was working too hard, sleeping too little, drinking too much coffee, and I was surrounded by people who were doing the exact same thing. We were all under tremendous pressure. We were all performing extraordinary feats of memorization and understanding every single day. We were all walking around on the edge of burnout. And for the first time, I started to wonder if maybe this was a broken system. If maybe the way I'd been raised, the way I'd been optimized and pushed and trained to sacrifice everything for achievement, was maybe not actually healthy. My therapist suggested this. Oh yes, I had a therapist. At Columbia Presbyterian Medical School, they basically forced you to go to therapy because they recognized that training people to be doctors while making them work 80 hours a week and absorbing the trauma of suffering and death on a regular basis is maybe not great for mental health. Her name was Dr. Chen, and she was a woman in her 50s who had this way of asking questions without judgment. In our first session, I told her my whole history, the demanding parents, the sacrifices, the comparison to Michael, the way I'd become the exceptional daughter who didn't need anything. "What do you want?" Dr. Chen asked me. "What do you mean?" I said. "What do you want? For your life, for your career, for your day-to-day existence? What do you actually want?" And I realized I had no idea. I'd never asked myself that question. I'd always been pursuing what was next, what was necessary, what would prove something, but I'd never stopped to consider what I actually wanted. "I don't know," I told her. "I think I want to be a doctor." "Do you?" she asked. "Or is that something you're supposed to want?" It was the kind of question that should have been annoying, but it wasn't. It was the kind of question that opened a door you didn't know was locked. I didn't break up with David because I suddenly decided I didn't want him. That would be too easy, too clean. What actually happened was slower and messier and more painful. He was a good boyfriend. That's the thing I keep coming back to. He was smart and funny and ambitious and good-looking, and he treated me well. He'd make dinner sometimes, he'd remember things I'd said, he was interested in my life. We had good sex. We fit together. On paper it made sense. But somewhere around the middle of my second year of med school, I started to notice that I was performing a version of myself around him. The version that had good grades and good prospects and was ambitious and focused and was building the right life. And the newer version of myself, the one that was questioning things, that was tired, that sometimes wanted to do nothing and feel nothing and not have to be exceptional at anything, that version of myself disappeared when he was around. He never asked her to disappear. That was the strange part. He never demanded that I be a certain way. But I knew somehow that the version of me that wanted to take a night off and watch trash TV instead of studying was not the version that fit into his life. That if I became someone who wanted to work as a community health doctor instead of at a prestigious hospital, someone who wasn't gunning for top honors and the most impressive job, someone who was okay with being ordinary, he wouldn't know how to want that person. So I kept performing, and the performance became more and more exhausting. By junior year of med school, I was depressed in a way I hadn't recognized as depression because I'd always just pushed through my feelings, treated them like obstacles to overcome rather than information to listen to. I was exhausted. I was seeing patients in the hospital and holding their hands while they cried and learning that everything I did might not matter anyway because people died. People got sicker. Medicine was not the noble, clear path to righteousness that I'd imagined it would be. I was 25 years old, and I realized I'd been trying to become someone since before I was born. That's when David proposed. He did it in a nice restaurant in Manhattan. He got down on one knee. He had a ring. It was all very much the way these things are supposed to go. And I said yes because saying no would have required explaining a bunch of things I couldn't yet articulate, and it was easier to say yes and figure out what to do later. Sometime around this same period, Michael got his life together. This is important because it changes the entire shape of the story. He'd taken his gap year and worked at the car rental place and did okay. He was living at home with my parents still, which my father was not happy about, but he was working and he was stable and he wasn't creating drama, which was more than could be said for a lot of his friends. Then he met someone. Her name was Rachel, and she was working at the car rental place as a manager. She was older than him by about 5 years. She was divorced. She had a daughter from her previous marriage named Lily who was 3 years old. She was, by conventional standards, exactly the kind of person my parents would not want Michael involved with. But Michael was happy. I heard about it from my mother during one of our weekly phone calls. She was carefully neutral in tone, the way she got when she was trying to be supportive but was genuinely concerned. "Michael's seeing someone," she said. "A woman he works with. She has a child." I could hear the subtext. He's making mistakes. He's being derailed. He's going to end up worse off. But when I eventually came home to visit and actually met Rachel, I understood something I hadn't understood before. She was nice. She was genuinely nice. She didn't seem to have an agenda. She wasn't pushing Michael toward anything, not college, not achievement, not any particular future. She was just there, present, and Michael around her seemed like a person who was at peace. They got engaged 6 months later. It was quick, and my father disapproved, but Michael didn't care what my father thought anymore. He'd spent his whole life being compared to me and found wanting, and he'd decided he wasn't going to spend his whole life trying to be what other people wanted him to be. He was going to be what made him happy. even if that was Rachel and Lily and a simple life that had nothing to do with college or prestige or becoming something my parents could be proud of. I remember sitting with Michael in our parents' living room one weekend when I was home from med school, and he told me they were moving in together. "I'm not going to college," he said to me, not like he was explaining but like he was stating a fact. "I know Mom and Dad think I'm going to change my mind, but I'm not. I'm good with Rachel. I'm good being a stepdad to Lily. I'm going to be fine." And he looked at me in a way that implied the real message. I'm going to be fine. Unlike you, who's going to be exceptional and successful and deeply, profoundly fine. That's good, I said, because it was. It was actually good. He seemed happy. And there was something about watching my brother be happy without needing to achieve anything, without needing to be validated by academic success or professional advancement or my parents' pride, that made me feel something sharp and bitter and true. If Michael could be happy without being exceptional, what did that say about all the years I'd spent being exceptional? What was I getting out of it? I got married in the summer before my last year of med school. It was at a country club in New Jersey, a wedding that my mother planned with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that she'd always given to important things. It was beautiful and tasteful, and everything a wedding is supposed to be. I wore a white dress that made me look like someone's bride, and David wore a suit that made him look like someone's groom, and we said vows that other people had written for us to say. My brother gave a toast that was funny and touching and that made people cry. My father gave a toast about his daughter who'd always made him proud. My mother gave a toast that was shorter, and at the end of it she said, "Sarah has always known what she wanted and she's gone after it. I hope you'll do the same thing, David, in building a life with her." And I heard it for what it was, a warning, a message that I was a person who did things, a person with purpose and direction, a person who got what she wanted. And David was marrying that person and he should know what he was signing up for. The thing is, David didn't really know me. He knew the public version of me, the successful version. He didn't know the version of me that was increasingly having panic attacks about my career, that was lying awake at night wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake, that was questioning everything that had been taken as foundational truth in my life. But I was committed now. I was married. I had a path. I was moving forward. I graduated from medical school in the spring. It was a moment that was supposed to feel triumphant. I'd made it. I'd done the thing. I was a doctor. My parents came to graduation and my father cried, which I'd never seen him do before. Not tears streaming down his face, but this genuine emotional response to the fact that his daughter had become a doctor, that the project of raising me with intense focus and sacrifice had culminated in this moment. My mother hugged me so tightly I couldn't breathe. And I felt absolutely nothing. Or not nothing, I felt sadness. I felt the weight of the achievement and it was heavy and it was not joyful. It was completion, but completion of something I'd never actually chosen. David was proud. My friends were celebrating. Everyone who'd invested in my success was pleased with the return on their investment. And I was watching it happen from inside my own body like it was happening to someone else. I did my residency in internal medicine at Columbia Presbyterian. For those 3 years, I was working 80-hour weeks, admitting patients, managing their care, learning how to be a doctor in the real world. And it was fine. It was more than fine, actually. I was good at it. People said I had good bedside manner, which apparently was code for, she actually treats patients like human beings instead of just interesting case studies. But I was also depressed. Actually clinically depressed, which I eventually acknowledged enough to start taking an SSRI for. I was drinking too much wine in the evenings. I was having panic attacks before shifts. I was having a very quiet, very private breakdown that no one noticed because I was excellent at my job. David and I were trying to have a baby, which is what married professionals in their late 20s were supposed to do. We'd bought a condo in Manhattan. We were building the life we'd been promised, but there was a distance between us that felt like it was growing, and I couldn't figure out how to bridge it because it wasn't about anything concrete. It was about something deeper, something about the fact that I'd married a version of myself instead of a person. Michael and Rachel, in the meantime, had bought a modest house in a modest neighborhood in Pennsylvania. Michael was working for Rachel's brother's construction company. Rachel had gotten pregnant and they had a son. Michael was happy. I would hear about these things through my mother, and I would feel this twisting thing inside my chest. It was envy, but for something I couldn't quite name. Not envy of Michael's life exactly. Envy of his peace. envy of the fact that he'd gotten off the treadmill and was okay. He was actually okay. And then my father had a heart attack. It was a big one. He was at work and he felt pain in his chest, and someone called an ambulance, and he had a massive heart attack in the cardiology ward of the hospital where he'd been taken. This was the kind of thing that happens in families and changes things. My mother called me at the hospital, crying, and I had to sit down because I was at work. I was working, and I had to process the fact that my father might be dying while also actively practicing medicine. I took the train to New Jersey that night. My father was in the hospital where I'd done rotations, and it was surreal to be in that hospital as the daughter of a patient instead of as a doctor. I felt the removal from my professional self very keenly. He survived. He'd had emergency bypass surgery and he survived, but the doctors said he was going to have to make some serious lifestyle changes. No more stress, more exercise, better diet. He'd been living on coffee and ambition for 56 years and his body had finally rebelled. My mother was shaken. She was trying to be strong for him, but I could see that she was terrified. She'd just survived cancer and now her husband had had a heart attack, and they were both fragile in ways they'd never been before. And Michael flew out. He left his family, his job, his life, and he came to New Jersey to help. He stayed for 3 weeks. He helped my mother around the house. He drove my father to appointments. He brought my father books to read while he recovered. He was there, present and available and unflinchingly committed to helping. And my father, lying in a hospital bed and facing his own mortality, finally softened toward Michael. I remember being there one afternoon, and my father was sitting in a chair by the window, and Michael was sitting next to him, and they were just quiet, not fighting, not competing, just 2 people in the same room. My father looked at me and he said, "Michael's a good son." And I felt something in me break because it was true, and my father had never said anything like that about Michael before, and the reason he was saying it now was because Michael had finally proven something, had finally done something valuable in his eyes. He'd come back and helped. But the message to me was clear. Michael was good because he'd finally done something my father could value. If he hadn't come, if he'd stayed in Pennsylvania building his simple, happy life, my father would never have seen him as good. That's the thing about a love that's conditional on achievement. Everyone loses. My father was recovering, but he was fundamentally changed. He couldn't go back to work in the same way. He was on medical leave. He was on a lot of medications. He was, for the first time in his life, vulnerable. And my mother was caring for him with a tenderness that made me realize how much she'd loved him, how much she'd been willing to endure in service of his ambitions and his plans, because she understood that his driving need to be successful was how he loved. That his insistence that Michael and I be exceptional was how he knew to show care. I went home for a week after his surgery, and I sat with them, and I started to understand some things about my parents that I hadn't understood before. They weren't bad people. They were people who were terrified of instability, who'd been shaped by immigration and economic precarity, and the belief that security only came through achievement. They'd wanted to protect us from that precarity by raising us to be exceptional. And the tool they'd chosen, comparison, pressure, conditional love, it had worked in the sense that I'd become a doctor and Michael had eventually become happy. But they'd also broken something. They'd created a daughter who didn't know how to want things except in comparison to someone else, who derived self-worth from external validation, who performed a life instead of living one. And they'd created a son who'd had to run away to be happy. "I'm sorry," my mother said to me one day while we were cooking. She said it out of nowhere, just dropped it into the silence of us chopping vegetables. "For what?" I asked. "For how we raised you," she said. "For making you responsible, for making us proud, for not letting you just be a kid." And I could have accepted that, I think. I could have let her apologize, could have reassured her that it was fine. It worked out. Look at me, I'm a doctor, exactly as planned. But I was tired of lying. "It wasn't fine," I said. "I'm not fine." And then I sat down at the kitchen table, and I cried in front of my mother for the first time in probably 15 years. I cried about everything I'd never let myself feel, the pressure, the loneliness, the constant sense of not being enough and simultaneously being too much. I cried about becoming a doctor because I thought I had to, not because I actually wanted to. I cried about marrying David because he fit the plan, not because I loved him. And my mother sat with me, and she cried too, and she said, I know, honey, I know." After my father recovered, after Michael went back to Pennsylvania, after I returned to Columbia Presbyterian and my residency, things started to move very quickly toward a collapse. I don't think it was because of that conversation with my mother. That conversation was important, but it was more like removing a cap on a bottle. It didn't create the pressure, it just revealed the pressure that had been building for a long time. I was breaking up with my husband, except I didn't know how to say it out loud yet. I was having panic attacks at work, except I was hiding them by going to the bathroom and sitting in a stall for 10 minutes before pulling myself together. I was questioning my entire career choice, except I was too invested in the identity of doctor to actually entertain the possibility that I'd made a mistake. So instead I existed in this suspended state of crisis that didn't look like crisis because I was still excellent at my job. I was still getting good evaluations. I was still the doctor who patients requested. I was still the person everyone thought had everything figured out. David knew something was wrong. He'd ask if I was okay, and I'd say I was fine, which we both knew was a lie. But we didn't have the tools to talk about the real problem, which wasn't something fixable. The problem was that I'd married someone I didn't actually know while not knowing myself at all. And then, actually, let me back up, because there's a person I haven't introduced yet, and they're going to be important to this story. Her name is Sarah. Yes, my name. She's a woman I met during my residency. She was an ER doctor, sharp and funny, and completely at ease in her own skin in a way I found both magnetic and deeply threatening. We became friends first. We'd grab coffee after shifts. We'd complain about patients and administrators and the general absurdity of the medical system. She'd tell me about her life, which was complicated and messy and completely authentic. She'd gone to a state school for undergrad. She'd gone to med school in the Midwest. She'd never been to prep school or Ivy League university. She was accomplished but also just normal. And one night, after a particularly brutal shift, we went to a bar and we were drinking, and she said to me, "Do you actually like being a doctor?" And I said no. Just like that, I said it out loud for the first time. "No, I don't actually like being a doctor." "Then why are you doing it?" she asked. And I started to tell her. I told her about my parents and the expectations and the sacrifice and the fact that I'd never actually chosen this. I told her about Michael and the comparison. I told her about David and the marriage that felt like it was happening to someone else. And Sarah, the other Sarah, just listened. She didn't try to fix it. She didn't suggest I was being ungrateful or that I should see it through. She just said, "That sounds really hard." And something about being recognized in my suffering by someone who was asking for nothing in return, no achievement, no performance, just recognition, broke me open again. I started going to therapy more regularly. Not just Dr. Chen, but she was my primary therapist, and we started to do some real work. We started to talk about what I actually wanted. We started to look at the patterns in my life, the achievement, the comparison, the performance, and actually question whether I wanted to keep living that way. And somewhere in that process, something in me became willing to make a change. I told David I wanted a separation. I did it on a Tuesday night in our apartment. I said, "I don't think this is working," and he said, "What do you mean this, our marriage?" And I said, "Yes." He was shocked, he was hurt. He wanted to know if there was someone else, and the answer was technically no, but also yes, there was someone, which was me. I was the person I'd been looking for in David, and I finally recognized that I had to find her on my own. We didn't tell people immediately. We said we were taking some time apart. David moved out. I stayed in the apartment, and I felt like I'd been drowning and had just broken the surface of water. It wasn't good, it wasn't clean, it was painful, but it was real. My parents had a very difficult time with this. My mother was supportive, but I could tell she was devastated. She'd loved David, and more importantly, she'd seen him as proof that I'd done everything right, that the sacrifice had culminated not just in my success as a doctor, but in my success as a wife, as someone building a good life. My father, still recovering from his heart attack, took it particularly hard. He felt like I was throwing away something precious. He'd worked his whole life to give me the opportunity to build a stable, accomplished life, and here I was, dismantling it. "What are you doing?" he said to me over the phone. "Why would you give up a marriage to a good man?" "Because I don't love him," I said. "Because I don't even know who I am when I'm with him." "You're a doctor," my father said. "You're a professional woman with an accomplished career, that's who you are." "That's what I do," I said. "That's not who I am." And my father was quiet for a long moment, and then he hung up the phone. He didn't hang up on me in anger exactly. It was more like he was closing a door, like he'd given me the tools to succeed, and I'd decided to use them to do something he couldn't comprehend, and he didn't know how to relate to that. I need to skip ahead a little bit, because the next year of my life was honestly kind of a blur. I finished my residency. I was offered a position at Columbia Presbyterian as an attending physician, which was exactly what was supposed to happen. I was supposed to be thrilled. I was supposed to feel like I'd finally arrived at the culmination of everything. Instead, I turned it down. I told them I needed some time to figure out what I actually wanted. I told them I might not return to Columbia Presbyterian. I told them I was having a crisis of career identity, and I couldn't responsibly care for patients while I was in the middle of that crisis. They were shocked. People didn't turn down positions at Columbia Presbyterian. People didn't walk away from the track that was supposed to define the rest of their life. But I did. I rented a smaller apartment in Washington Heights, and I got a temporary job at a community health clinic instead. The pay was terrible. The hours were unpredictable. The patients were mostly uninsured or underinsured immigrants, people without resources, people my father had taught me to think of as people whose problems couldn't be solved by good medicine alone. And I loved it. For the first time in my career, I was seeing patients not because they were interesting cases, or because saving them would reflect well on me, or because they fit into my resume, but because they needed help and I could give them help. There was a woman named Maria who came in with untreated hypertension. She'd been too scared to go to a doctor because she was undocumented. She came in because she'd been having headaches and her neighbor had recommended our clinic. And I spent time with her, real time, talking about her health, her life, what was making her stressed. And then I helped her find resources, a low-cost medication, a program that would see her without documentation. And the next time she came in, her blood pressure was better, and she hugged me. Not because I was exceptional, because I'd helped. That was different. During this time, I reconnected with Michael. Not because anything specific happened, but because my life became less regimented, and I had space to think about people outside of the structure of achievement and comparison. I called him one day just to talk. He was surprised to hear from me. We weren't really regular phone call people. We'd been shaped into a family that communicated through our parents, through occasional visits, through the annual reports of who was doing what. "Hi," I said, "how are you?" "Good," he said, "how are you? Mom said you were going through something." "Yeah," I said, "I'm getting divorced." "Oh," Michael said, "I'm sorry." "Don't be," I said, "I think it's the right thing." And we talked for 3 hours. We talked about our lives, about our parents, about the pressure we'd grown up under. Michael told me about his family, Rachel and Lily and his son Jack. He told me about his work in construction, how he liked working with his hands, how it felt good to build things that were real and tangible. "I'm never going to be what they wanted me to be," Michael said, "but I'm okay with that now." "What did they want you to be?" I asked. "Like you," he said simply. "They wanted me to be like you." And I felt something heavy settle in my chest. "Michael, I'm not okay," I said. I'm pretending to be okay, but I'm not." "I know," he said. "I could always see that. Even when we were kids, I could see that you weren't actually happy. You were just really, really good at doing what you were supposed to do." "I hate that I was the comparison," he continued. "I hated that whatever I did wrong made you look good, and I knew that me failing made you more special, and I knew that and I hated it, but I couldn't stop failing because I was so angry at being compared." "I'm sorry," I said. "Don't be sorry," Michael said. "Just be happy, okay? Actually be happy, not like achieve happiness, just find it somewhere." After I got off the phone with Michael, I cried. Not because anything was resolved, but because someone finally saw me clearly and it didn't matter to them. Michael wasn't comparing me. He wasn't disappointed in me for turning down the prestigious job. He wasn't angry that I was breaking from the plan. He was just glad I was finally trying to be okay. That's when something shifted in me. I realized that I'd been so focused on becoming someone my parents would be proud of that I'd never become someone I could be proud of. And those weren't the same thing. My parents had needed me to be exceptional, to feel successful at parenting. But they'd never asked me what I needed. They'd never asked if the path they'd chosen for me was a path I actually wanted to walk. I was 29 years old, and I was starting to understand that I might have to rebuild my entire sense of self from scratch. The thing that actually broke me, the real breakdown, not the quiet crisis I'd been managing, happened about 6 months after I started working at the community clinic. It was a patient named Elena. She was 62 years old, and she came in with chest pain. She'd been having chest pain for about a week, and she was terrified because she knew chest pain could mean a heart attack, and she couldn't afford to have a heart attack because she was the primary caregiver for her granddaughter. I did an EKG, I did blood work, everything looked fine, no sign of a myocardial infarction, no cardiac enzymes elevated, everything said she was okay. But she kept saying, "But I feel like something's wrong, I feel it here," and she'd touch her chest. And I did something I'd never done in all my years of medical training. I listened to what she was saying without immediately translating it into medical terms. I just listened. "I'm scared," she said. "My daughter is gone. She left my granddaughter with me and she left our lives, and I'm scared that I'm going to die and this baby is going to have no one." And her chest pain, I realized, was probably anxiety. It was probably the weight of responsibility and fear and the burden of being the person someone else depended on. "Let me help you with this," I said. And I did. I spent time with her, the kind of time medicine doesn't really allow for, but I made the time. I called social services and we looked at options for her, for support, for ways to build a safety net so she wasn't entirely alone in her fear. She got referred to therapy. She got information about programs that could help her, and when she left she was crying, but it was a different kind of crying. It was relief. And I drove home that night, and I had a panic attack so severe that I had to pull over. Because I realized that for 30 years, I had been Elena. I had been carrying a weight that wasn't mine to carry. I had been responsible for making my parents feel successful and secure. I had been the safety net that caught my family when they were afraid of falling. And no one had ever asked if I was okay with that. I sat in my car on the side of a highway in Manhattan, and I cried harder than I'd ever cried in my life. Not the controlled, managed crying I'd learned to do, but the kind of crying that comes from deep inside, that isn't performative, that just needs to exist. And then I went home and I called my mother. "I need to talk to you and Dad," I said, "about everything, all of it." We did it over video call because my father still wasn't traveling well, and my mother didn't want to leave him alone for long periods. I sat in my apartment, and my parents sat in the living room of the house I'd grown up in, and I told them the truth. I told them that I didn't want to be a doctor, that I'd become a doctor because they wanted me to, because I thought that would finally be enough, finally would prove that all the sacrifice had been worth it, that I'd spent my entire life performing a version of myself that I thought they could love and be proud of. I told them that I'd married David for the same reason, because he fit into the plan, not because I loved him. I told them that watching Michael struggle, while they focused on me, had created a resentment in me that I'd carried for years. That Michael had worked harder to become happy than I'd worked to become successful, and I was just now realizing what that meant. I told them that I was angry at them, not for loving me, but for loving the idea of who I could become more than they loved who I actually was. My father was silent the whole time, truly silent. He didn't interrupt, he didn't try to defend himself, he just listened. My mother cried. When I finished, my father said, "I didn't know." "I know you didn't know," I said, "but that's kind of the problem." "We did everything we could to give you opportunity," my father said. "Everything." "I know," I said, "but it was your opportunity, not mine. You wanted to give me what you didn't have, but you didn't ask what I actually wanted." And my father looked away, and I could see in his face that he was understanding something for the first time, that his project of excellence, his way of loving his children through pushing them toward achievement, had cost something. It had cost me something. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I'm sorry, Sarah, I didn't know how to love you any other way." And that's when I understood. My father didn't know how to love without achievement. He didn't have a model for it. His own father had been harsh and demanding, and my father had promised himself he'd be different, that he'd be supportive, that he'd push his children because he loved them. But he'd confused pushing with loving. He'd conflated achievement with worth. And I was the product of that confusion. "I know," I said, and I'm sorry I couldn't just accept it and be happy, but I can't. The healing didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly in pieces, with a lot of backsliding and difficult days and moments when I'd think I was fine, and then something would trigger the old patterns, and I'd be back in that place of trying to prove something. But I did start to build a different life. I broke up with David officially. The divorce was amicable. He found a lawyer who was nice, and we split things fairly, and we ended on terms that suggested that maybe we could eventually be friends, or at least not enemies. I stayed at the community clinic. I got promoted. I started training other doctors who were just out of residency, teaching them to actually listen to their patients. I took on extra shifts, and I didn't do it for the prestige or the achievement. I did it because I wanted to. I started dating, but casually, without the sense that I needed to find someone to complete the plan. I went out with people I didn't match up with, and it was fine. I went on dates that didn't go anywhere, and that was fine too. I was learning to be comfortable with not having everything figured out. And slowly, I started to feel like myself. Which is to say, I started to feel like someone, rather than like the idea of someone. Now I need to tell you the thing that changes everything. Or rather, the thing that makes you rethink everything that came before it. My father had another health incident about a year after we had that video call. Not a heart attack, but a health scare, something that made him face his own mortality again. And during his recovery, he started seeing a therapist. I know this sounds like a small thing, but to know my father who'd achieved everything through willpower and refusal to be vulnerable, my father who'd shown love through achievement because he'd never learned any other language, to know that he was sitting in an office with a therapist, trying to learn a different way to be, that meant everything. He called me one day and he said, "I understand why you're angry." Just like that, no preamble, no trying to explain himself or defend himself, just simple acknowledgement. "I understand why you're angry at me because I made you carry something that wasn't yours to carry. I understand that now." And I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness exactly. It was more than that. It was understanding that my father was also a victim of the system he'd created, that he'd been trying to protect me the only way he knew how, that his damage had manifested as pressure, and that he was finally seeing that and trying to do something about it. "Thank you," I said, "for understanding." "I love you," my father said. "I need you to know that. I love you not because of what you've achieved, just because you're you." And I cried. I cried because I was 30 years old and I was hearing my father say something he'd maybe always felt, but never knew how to express. "I love you too," I said. Michael got in touch with me around this same time. He had some news. He and Rachel were expecting again, a third child. He was genuinely happy about it and he wanted to know if I'd come visit. He wanted me to meet his family properly, not just in passing at Christmas, but to actually spend time with them. I took a week of vacation and I drove to Pennsylvania. Their house was small and messy and full of life. There were toys on the floor and dishes in the sink and kids running around yelling about nothing important. Rachel was pregnant and glowing with it, and Michael was happy in a way that seemed to radiate from his whole being. He gave me a tour. "This is Lily, she's 11, she's into horses, Jack's 8 and he's a total goofball. And there's the baby," and he put his hand on Rachel's belly. I sat with them and I watched their life, and I realized something crucial. Michael was not a failure. We'd all been told he was a failure. My father had certainly communicated that. My parents' original concern about him had been that he wouldn't amount to anything. And by the conventional metrics, he didn't go to college, he's not a doctor or a lawyer or an executive, he hasn't amounted to anything. But he's happy. He's genuinely, authentically happy. He has a partner who loves him, children who adore him, work that feels meaningful, and a sense of purpose that doesn't come from achievement. And he's worth more than all the achievements I've accumulated. "I'm sorry," I said to Michael, sitting on his porch with a beer watching the sun go down. "For what?" he asked. "For the years I was comparing myself to you, for being glad when you failed because it made me look good, for not seeing you." "Hey," Michael said, "I'm not angry about that, that's not on you, that's on Mom and Dad for putting us against each other, we were just kids." "I know," I said, "but I'm sorry anyway." "Okay," Michael said, "I forgive you, and Sarah, I'm glad you're finally happy, I can tell you are, you look different." How do I look different? I asked. Like you're actually here, he said. Like you're not performing some version of what you think you're supposed to be. Here's the thing about betrayal that I didn't understand until much later. The betrayal wasn't actually an event, it was a system. I was betrayed not by one person or one moment, but by an entire framework of love that was conditional on achievement, by parents who loved me in proportion to what I could accomplish, by a society that told me my value was tied to my success, by myself for internalizing that message so thoroughly that I became my own betrayer. The real betrayal was the message that I could be worthy only if I was exceptional. And the healing has been learning that I'm worthy just for existing, that my parents' pressure on me, while damaging, came from their own damage, their own fear, their own broken models of love, that I can forgive them without excusing them, that I can understand why they did what they did while also acknowledging that it hurt. It's been 3 years since I left the prestigious job at Columbia Presbyterian. I'm still working at the community clinic. I've been promoted to medical director. I'm training doctors. I'm still seeing patients. I'm still working with undocumented immigrants and people without resources and people who have been failed by systems designed to fail them. And I love my work, not in the way I loved the idea of being a doctor, but in the actual, deep, genuine way that comes from knowing that you're helping people and that's enough. I'm not married. I've been dating someone, but I'm taking my time. His name is James and he's a teacher, and he makes me laugh, and most importantly, he seems to like me when I'm not achieving anything. He's met me at my worst and he's still here. My parents are better. They're in their 60s now and they're trying. My father is doing regular therapy. My mother has taken up painting, something she always wanted to do but never made time for. They're rebuilding their marriage on some different foundation, one that doesn't involve me being their achievement trophy. And Michael is thriving. He and Rachel had the baby, a girl, and Michael sent me a photo, and he looked happier than I'd ever seen him. And I sent a text that just said, "She's beautiful," and he sent back a smiley face. That's where we are now. But here's what I want to say to end this, because I think I've been leading to this the whole time. I was walking home from work a few weeks ago, and I stopped to buy a coffee from a street vendor. He was an older man, maybe 60s, with a heavy accent I couldn't quite place. I ordered my coffee, and as he was making it, his hands shook slightly. He spilled a little bit of water on the counter. "Sorry," he said, "my hands, they're not so steady today." "It's okay," I said. As he was giving me the coffee, he smiled at me and said, "You look sad today, bad day at work." "No," I said, "not a bad day." "Then why sad?" he asked. And I realized that I was sad, not in an active, conscious way, but in the way you can be sad while also being content, the way you can carry grief alongside peace. "I'm grieving something," I said finally. "What are you grieving?" he asked. "The person I thought I had to become." He nodded like he understood. "That person, she's not real." "She was real," I said, "but she wasn't me." "Then good," he said, "good that she's gone. Who is real now?" And I thought about that question all the way home. Who is real now? I'm someone who cares for patients. I'm someone who loves her brother imperfectly and honestly. I'm someone who's learning to accept love from her parents, knowing it comes from a place of brokenness, but also from a place of trying. I'm someone who's still scared of failure, but who's learning to fail and survive it. I'm not exceptional. I'm not someone who will make headlines or change the world or become famous. I'm not the kind of person my father dreamed of raising. But I'm someone who is here, who is present, who is trying. And that's enough. Epilogue. I haven't spoken much about the moment that mattered most, the thing that seems small but becomes significant later. During my second year of medical school, when my mother was going through chemo and everything was terrifying, I had a particularly brutal rotation. I was exhausted, I was worried about my mother, I was sad in a way I couldn't express. I was sitting in the hospital cafeteria one afternoon, and I was just staring at my food, not eating it, just existing in the space of it. A woman sat down across from me. She was older, maybe 40, and I didn't know her. She worked in the hospital, but I'd never seen her before. "You look like you're having a rough time," she said. "I'm fine," I said, which was the automatic response. "You don't have to be fine," she said. And then she did something that seems so small, but at the time meant everything. She put her hand on mine. "Your mother?" she asked. "How did you know?" I said. "I can see it in your face," she said. "I had a mother too, I understand that look." We didn't talk for long, maybe 5 minutes. She told me that her mother had gotten through her illness and her mother was fine and her mother was proud of her, and then she got up and left. I never saw her again. At the time, I remember thinking it was a nice moment, but I was too stressed and sad to absorb it properly. I filed it away as stranger was kind to me, and that was that. But I've thought about it 1,000 times since. Because that moment, that small moment of someone seeing me and not demanding anything from me and just offering presents, that moment kept me afloat. During the hardest years, when I was convinced I was failing, that moment would come back to me and I'd remember that someone, a stranger, had looked at me and seen something worth acknowledging. I don't know who she was, I don't know if she even remembers it, but that moment changed my life. Because it showed me what love could be without achievement, what seeing someone could be without comparison, what caring could be without condition. And I've tried to be that person for other people ever since. I see patients at the clinic and I see their pain and I don't ask them what they've accomplished or what they're working toward. I just see them, I bear witness, I offer presence. And sometimes that's everything. So this is my story. I'm Sarah, I'm 32 years old. And I'm the daughter of people who loved me the best they knew how, and I'm the sister of someone who taught me what real happiness looks like, and I'm a doctor who serves people who have been served by almost no one else, and I'm someone who's finally learning to be kind to herself. I don't know if this helps anyone, I don't know if my story matters, but I've finally stopped needing it to matter in order for me to tell it. It matters to me, and that's enough.